Critical periods are a time, in this case we're going to call it prenatal time, is a period before birth, right? A window in which an organism is more or less reactive to outside influences or internal influences. It's critical because that sensitivity means that there is more chance for damage prenatally during certain periods, right? More chances for what? Birth defects are what we're talking about prenatally. But there are periods after birth in people's lives that are also more or less sensitive periods. You develop language in your early years, starting out by babbling and forming syllables, and then forming words, and then telegraphic speech. Then you learn the rules of grammar, and then you have a symbol system now that helps you interpret reality and transmit your interpretation of reality to other people through a thing we call language. Most people learn the language of the family they're born into. But there's this sensitive period in early childhood where you could pick up multiple languages relatively easily. So if you live in a bilingual or trilingual house, this sensitive period allows you to acquire multiple symbol systems that are languages fairly easily. But once you exit adolescence, that sensitive period passes and now it becomes relatively difficult to acquire a new symbol system, right? Anybody that's taken a foreign language for the first time in high school or later can attest to the fact that it's hard to do. But it was easy to do early in life, and that's reflecting a postnatal sensitive period versus a prenatal critical period where you can do great amounts of damage with relatively little negative influence. So sometimes you have devastating effects. Maternal malnutrition can be one of those things. We're talking prenatal now. That increases risk for birth defects or birth complication, and birth complication can give you postnatal effects, right? Cutting off the oxygen flow, for example, because you have an umbilical cord wrapped around the neck, oxygen flow to the brain, right? Deprived of oxygen, brain cells die, and as I've already told you in the previous section, they don't grow back. You don't get new ones. So you can have permanent damage from a relatively brief period of oxygen deprivation to the brain. But malnutrition means that you are not getting the vitamins and minerals that you need to sustain the growth of the single-cell organism into a multi-cell organism, going from an embryo to a fetus. And this is where people get into massive debates, even violent debates, over what is life and when does it begin. And this gets into a debate about abortion, pro-life. Nobody's actually pro-abortion. Nobody's like, kill the babies. They are questioning at what stage life becomes viable, at what stage you define it as a person, at what stage do you declare the mother's health to be at risk versus the risk of the potential child that would come forth. And I'm not giving you the answers because I don't have them. And I would suggest that nobody does, because it becomes a matter of personal interpretation about what your ideas are for spirituality, God, physicality, what it's worth being born with, massive defects or none at all, whether you have the ability financially or emotionally to raise a child, whether there are options to adopt out to people who have those abilities. These are really, really, really complicated issues, and I would respect wherever you stand on any of those issues, because it is your choice and it is your value and you should have it. But you should be informed as equally as much about the other side's viewpoint. To assume that they're all crazy or wrong is fundamentally what human beings do when people differ from them, right? But they're just as passionate on both sides of every argument you want to come up with. And in this case, it's debatable by definition. If it wasn't debatable, there wouldn't be a debate, right? So keep in mind that when people oppose you, you can strengthen your own arguments if you better understand their arguments. Or you might gain more compassion for the other side, whatever that other side may be on any debate, if you inform yourself about how they see things. because it turns out we're all human beings prone to making pretty radical conclusions and then sticking with them. But when we're talking about this period of prenatal development, it's a lot of variety. When we're going from a double cell to a single cell, back to multiple cells that don't look anything like a person, to a thing that looks a lot like an alien, to something that looks definitively like a person, there's a lot of room for interpretation. And there's a lot of room for problems, especially in the embryonic phases. The first few weeks, before we get to the fetal stage, you can cause a lot of problems with a little bit of damage, right? Now, once you get past that, it doesn't mean you can't cause damage. It just means that the damage caused is likely to be less intense or maybe less prolonged after birth or things of that nature. So teratogens would be external environmental insults to the organism at whatever stage it's in. So substances that produce birth defects are many. You know some of them, pretty quick, we can name a few, right? Mercury, lead. Well, those are substances that a mother might be exposed to without even realizing it. That would then be crossing the placental barrier. In your brain, you have blood vessels, and they deliver the nutrients in and the waste products out, and they have a thing called tight gap junctions. In other words, the cells that make up the vessel wall are tightly packed together such that anything that goes into the brain has to pass through two cell walls, right? And that keeps many substances out of your brain, such that the substances you feel affecting your brain, whether it's nicotine or caffeine or other kinds of things, drugs of choice or of abuse, they're able to pass the blood-brain barrier. They're able to go through those vessel wall cells into the brain and have an effect. Well, other molecules need to get to the developing organism prenatal at all stages of gestation, right? And so you can't have that tight of a gap. You got looser gaps between the cells, and larger molecules can cross that barrier called the placental barrier. It still serves as a screening mechanism, and it'll screen out some kinds of molecules, but you got to get in nutrients and you got to get out waste products, and other kinds of molecules can slip in. So anything that can affect your brain can by definition affect the unborn, right? Because if it can cross the blood-brain barrier, it can most certainly pass through the placental barrier. So you now have to worry about what kind of things are going into the mother's system. Teratogens is what we call them. Drugs, as I've alluded to, readily cross the placental barrier because they will cross the blood-brain barrier. And they can have various effects on the unborn child. Unborn child, unborn fetus, unborn embryo, however you choose to call it. The organism that is in gestation, if it affects the mother, it affects that organism too. In very much the same way. If one takes an amphetamine and increases the mother's heart rate, it will also, assuming that the heart is developed, increase the fetus's heart rate, right? We look at things like narcotics. Those increase chance for early death due to prematurity. So these babies oftentimes are born earlier than they would be. They're premature babies. That puts them at risk depending on what period of time they're born in. In America and other industrialized countries, we've made remarkable progress in how early a child can be born that we can keep them alive. A child could be born as early as 5 months of gestation and through heroic medical efforts kept alive until they are viable on their own and released from the hospital. 30 years ago, they'd be dead. There just wasn't an option to keep you alive. You got to get surfactant on the lungs to inflate the lungs to be able to breathe on your own. But things like respirators and IVs and sterile environments allow us to do some amazing things. But offspring of mothers who abuse narcotics heavily are likely to be premature. It doesn't guarantee they'll be premature. Cocaine is just one type of amphetamine. There's lots of them, right? You've heard of meth. There's many types of amphetamines. We'll talk about those in a later chapter. And these create a lot of defects, including heart problems and brain seizures. They could be fatal, but they can also cause heart arrhythmias and heart murmurs because you're now tasking that unborn heart at a rate that would be hard for an adult to take. At high enough levels of cocaine use, you'll die. You will go into cardiac arrest. It's more than your heart can bear. So imagine what it is like on the unborn, right? It's a magnified effect because the same dose is hitting them as is hitting the adult. Alcohol. Alcohol abuse is probably what we're talking about here, but abuse can be short-term, like in a giant binge of high doses, or it could be long-term, but maybe moderate doses taken in over a longer period. We don't really know, and it's hard to say, and that's one of the problems with assessing damage, quote-unquote damage, because if we have these teratogens at play, I don't know what development could have been. All I know is what I get. And I don't know if that's a damaged set of developmental parameters or if that's normal. Depends. Sometimes with fetal alcohol syndrome, that's a severe damage that you can see at birth. Includes microcephaly, a relatively small head. Now you know babies, they got big old heads, don't they? And it's one of the things that makes them cute. They got a big old wobbly head on that tiny body, right? But being born with a small head is indicative of some problems, right? Relatively small head. Heart defects, irritability, hyperactivity, mental retardation. Most kinds of mental retardation are actually not genetic. One you're probably familiar with would be Down syndrome, right? It retards mental processes. It's not an insult. It's a clinical designation. So knowing that, I hope you will use the word a little more carefully than is usually used in colloquial expressions. When you say retarded clinically, what you mean is you have intellectual deficits. You don't have value deficits. You have wonderful children who have problems with certain kinds of cognition, right? But most kinds of mental retardation are not caused by genetics. They're caused by birth defects and insults to the early born organism in very early childhood. Drop on the head, for example, or being exposed to lead-based paint where a kid might eat paint chips because you know what kids put in their mouth when they're tiny? Everything. So what we see is with alcohol in high quantities, you can cause these problems, mental retardation. Now, I point this out, back in the day, you weren't told as a mother that you shouldn't drink and that you shouldn't do drugs and that you shouldn't smoke and all of these things. My mom drank normally. She wasn't an abuser of alcohol. She was a social drinker, a few drinks here and there on occasions. That probably didn't affect my development, right? But how do I know? You see, we have these biological frameworks that we exist in. I'm 6 feet tall. Genetically speaking, unless something went terribly wrong, I was going to be in this neighborhood. But it could have been that if I had had less nutrients growing up or less exercise, I might be 5'10", right? But I'm not going to be 5 feet. Developmental window's kind of set, but it's a window. On the converse, if I had maybe higher protein, more nutritious meals because I ate better as a child and exercised more, I might be 6'2". But no matter what I ate or what I did, I'm not going to be 7 feet. So I have this window. So if I can measure my ability at any given point, I don't know how much higher it could have been or how much lower it could have been based on what happened. All I know is it possible. So you look at something like smoking, and smoking reduces oxygen and nutrient flow because it constricts blood vessels, right? When you tighten them blood vessels up, right, now you're restricting the flow of oxygen and nutrients across the placental barrier. Every time you have a cigarette, the temperature in your hand becomes appreciably different, measurably different. It becomes cooler because your capillaries are constricting. Now, you probably don't notice it as you're smoking, but it's happening and it's measuring. It's measurable. And think about that on a much smaller scale. On a chronic level, you can cause serious issues, including risk for miscarriage, stillbirth, prematurity, and a thing called SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. We don't know why it does what it does. All we know is that not every child of a smoker is going to have these problems, right? Because there's individual variability. but that children of smokers are at higher risk for dying in the crib after being completely healthy, or what appears to be completely healthy. Has to do possibly with being able to turn over, and placement becomes important of a child before, because they can't actually move their bodies until they develop upper body strength, and that takes time and exercise, right? And so what you have is this set of situations where, guess what? The period for the greatest damage is in the first 2 months. Right? Critical period, the most critical period is the first 2 months of gestation, a time which many women do not even realize what? They're pregnant. And then you have other additional issues. If somebody's addicted, they may really, really want to quit for the sake of the child once they learn that they're carrying a child, but it doesn't mean that it's easier for them now to quit than anybody else. So problems with addiction are serious, and problems with causing birth defects in this most critical period are set before the person even knows that they might be pregnant. Y'all have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.